Hello and welcome to this Jose Capablanca video in which Capablanca, the third world chess champion from the 1920s, almost 100 years ago, slays the Sicilian dragon defense. So let's see how he did that, and more importantly, what we can learn from the great former world chess champion and one of the greatest chess players of all time. So, this game took place in 1929 in Barcelona. He is playing with the white pieces against Edgar Colley, also a great player, and I believe the Colley defense, a good chess opening system, is named after Edgar Colley. So let's see what happened. All right, Capablanca begins with this move. C4. So you're thinking, wait a minute, this is supposed to be a video about him playing against and defeating the Sicilian dragon. Well, this also shows you some good examples of how transposition can play out in chess games, where you start with one opening and change into another one. And you can use this to your advantage if you're able to steer the game into an opening that you're more familiar with than your opponent. So it starts off as an English opening. The response is this flexible knight developing move here. And this, basically controls squares in the center here, and waits for Capablanca to make a move. So Capablanca develops his knight as well, keeping things even over here on the king side. And now black equalizes on the queen side. So we're still in an English opening, but it's about to change into a Sicilian defense with the dragon variation. So first we have some more developing. Knight up to c3, which is a logical move. If you push that c pawn forward, it's attacking the d5 square. Now the knight jumps in there, adding more pressure and also helping control the center. So the same is played by Colley, playing safe, keeping things even. And the game continues with d4, immediately striking in the center here, pushing that central pawn. You're attacking this pawn. Now, the best move, according to the computer, is for black to capture that central pawn here, which would give up a flank pawn for this pawn in the center. So let's see if that happens. Yes, the best move is played. After a recapture, now what? It looks like the computer has, a few different moves. Two, actually. E6 or queen to b6. So instead, this move is played, which is still good, but maybe not the best. After this exchange of knights, it helps the queen develop to the center, and Capablanca has the equivalent of half a pawn or a little bit more advantage, even though material is still even at this point. He does have two pieces developed with this strong queen in the center, and the game continues with this move, g6. So we're slowly steering into I think an accelerated dragon in the Sicilian defense. That would normally start out with e4 and then c5. If you're familiar with the Sicilian dragon, which, or even the Sicilian at all, which is probably why you're watching this video. So let's move on with it here. Now we finally have this e4 move, and as you see, the computer lets us know that now we're in the open Sicilian defense, accelerated dragon variation with a Maroczy bind formation. Now, I know that was a mouthful for the beginners out there. The Maroczy bind is when you play a Sicilian defense, which begins, as I mentioned, with pawn to e4 by white, pawn to c5 by black, and after some exchanges, usually the c pawn for the d pawn, you get a situation similar to this where the Maroczy bind is a pawn on e4 and c4, which clamps down on this important d5 square, because one of the strategies in the Sicilian defense is to push this pawn to d5. And of course you don't want to do that now, or it would just be captured and you wouldn't be able to get your material back anytime soon. So this is the strategy here. Everything is helping control this central d5 square. White has a big lockdown on the position. And if you're trying to get counterplay, one thing you have to look at is pawn levers. Where to push pawns to give you space to attack your opponent. And as I said, in the Sicilian defense, this d5 pawn push is usually one of the big pawn moves for the Sicilian defense. But usually you have to set it up, maybe with e6 first and then pushing, but that's not possible with all these pieces and pawns covering d5 here. All right, the game continues with d6 being played instead, which does allow this bishop to be developed at some point. And let's see here. The computer gives a few possibilities. Capablanca just develops. Now he can, possibly castle to the queen side, but usually that's not played in this. Often the bishop will develop here and the king will castle to the king side. So now we have bishop to g7. So this is looking more like a dragon variation in the Sicilian, where you have these pawns here, perhaps creating the shape of a dragon. And then this might be the mouth of the dragon, and the flames shoot out with the bishop here aiming down through the center of the board, lined up on the queen at this point. But Capablanca ignores that, pushes this f3, or this pawn to f3, another good strategy in this accelerated dragon Maroczy bind formation. This fortifies the e4 square, prevents the knight from jumping down here and harassing the bishop, and it also prevents and really restricts the light squared bishop as well. So the game continues with queen developing with a pin on the knight against the king. So also, once black castles kingside, this is going to be a threat. If this knight moves away, right now you could just capture the bishop, but that could be a threat in the future if black castles kingside. So the game continues with a retreat by the queen, the best move in the position according to the computer. So Capablanca drops his queen back, breaking the pin, and also creating this battery. And this is another good strategy when you have a fianchettoed position. If you can push your bishop with this queen and bishop battery up here and try and exchange off the dark squared bishops, well, that would leave holes around this kingside position, especially if black castle's there. These weaknesses could be used to advantage, especially if you start pushing these pawns up the board, trying to open things up for the rook and the queen here. So we have this defensive move, preventing the knight from jumping forward here with a future threat of a fork, perhaps. Also, maybe getting ready to push this pawn forward. As I said, pawn breaks are important. You have to figure out where you can push your pawns to open up the position to attack. So another common move is played, bishop to e2 here, which you might be wondering, well, why didn't you go here? Well, this file is half open. You may want to bring a rook over here at some point and use these pieces on the half open file. So, the bishop moves to e2 so as not to block the half open file. And also, if this f pawn wants to push in the future, the bishop will be covering this square or helping to cover it. At the moment, there are two pieces that could jump forward here, and only the bishop would be covering that if this pawn moved up to f4. So the game continues with bishop developing. Does this move seem strange? Maybe a little bit, but this is a possible move. Maybe not best. The computer preferred castling. And you may wonder, well, why didn't the bishop just go here? Well, maybe if the knight wanted to reposition here or here, or help just drop back and then move up here to help fight for this square on d5. Anyway, you don't want to get your pieces tangled in each other's way. If the bishop would have developed here to d7, then it takes away a repositioning square for that knight, perhaps, because from there the knight could jump forward into the center or even jump over here. Let's see what happens. Capablanca moves his rook over here to help defend this, which could come under attack, this c4 pawn, and also it helps cover the knight here in case that bishop is unleashed along with the queen attacking. So now we have the rook moving to c8, a common move in this position. As the rook grabs the half open file, applies a little more pressure to this pawn. So Capablanca defends the pawn. And now, what should be played here? The computer recommends dropping the knight back to d7, getting ready to reposition it. And sure enough, that's what happens. Now the computer's a little unsure, saying that perhaps castling immediately would have been better. So the game continues with castling by Capablanca, trying to finish up his development. And now black castles as well, and that's the first inaccuracy of the game. Apparently an immediate b5 would have been better, pressing that pawn forward, trying to get some attack going on the queen side here. So the knight jumps into the center, and now the threat is a fork, capturing this pawn, forking king and rook. So what does Kali do? He drops the queen back and defends, the best move in the position. And also, this is a good strategy where you can take a bishop or the queen, and you're covering all these squares that the knight could potentially jump to. All right. Game continues with queen development, and now the first inaccuracy played by Capablanca. He targets the unprotected pawn, and also, maybe he thought this would help prevent this pawn from pushing forward, where it could just be captured, capture, queen captures, and white would go ahead a pawn. What does the computer prefer? Well, knight to f4, targeting this bishop that has nowhere to go, potentially getting rid of the bishop pair and also doubling up pawns. Although if there was a recapture with the pawn, it would pull that pawn to the center, and it might help you fight for the center with that extra pawn there, and it gives the rook a half open file, although that's blocked by the pawn here. All right, moving on. We have a capture. That bishop wasn't going anywhere, so to avoid the doubled pawns, we have a capture, and then Capablanca captures towards the center, unleashes the rook on the open file. So after capture, recapture, Capablanca is controlling the open file for the moment. So the game continues with the queen stepping to the side, perhaps getting ready to fight for that open file. And now Capablanca finds a great move. He immediately places his queen on the open file to really lock down that open C file, the only completely open file on the board here. So it makes sense to fight for that. Also, the bishop is helping prevent this knight from moving forward. So what does Kali do here? It looks like the best move, according to the computer, is knight to c5, perhaps. But it's kind of looking a little rough here for Kali. He plays another inaccuracy, bishop to b2, targeting the rook, but Capablanca just presses forward, counterattacking the bishop, and the bishop is forced to move away and finds the best square here. So, what does this move do? Well, I guess it gives the king the possibility of moving off the back rank if needed. The game continues with pawn to f4. Another inaccuracy, according to the computer, it looks like b4 was preferred, which would maybe keep the knight from jumping forward here. Although that knight probably wouldn't want to go there anyway, because you could have capture, pawn captures, then queen captures. It would just be losing a pawn. So the game continues with the first mistake, rook to d8, guarding the knight, but this is a mistake, and let's see how Capablanca takes advantage of it. Apparently knight to c5 was preferred, even though, well, I mentioned if the bishop captures, instead of recapturing, then that rook could move there, pinning the bishop to the queen. So that's a possibility as well. All right, Capablanca, he plays queen to c7. Now, apparently b4 was a little bit better, but after this move, we have queen retreating, avoiding the queen trade, and apparently the computer likes bishop to a1 better, which may be, I don't know, that move doesn't look great, but it would allow a queen trade, and Kali wanted to avoid that. So now we have bishop developing, adding more pressure to this knight along with the queen, and there's only one defender here. So the knight is forced to retreat or jump forward, as it does here. And now, what should be played? Well, you could go ahead and capture and go for that pawn, but instead, e5 is found, counterattacking here, ignoring that knight, targeting the bishop. So after the bishop retreats, which is best, now we have pawn captures on e7, the best move in the position. And it's pretty much lost at this point, the game for Kali. He's pretty much losing. The computer says that Capablanca is ahead +3 and then some after this. So the best move apparently is b6. But this move is played, which just gives a little bit more of an advantage to Capablanca. Perhaps this move was played to allow some breathing room for the king, but if it moves there, the queen could try and pick this off, perhaps. So the game continues with a brilliant move by Capablanca. He pushes the pawn forward, and computer basically says king to h7 would be best here. Instead, Kali falls for the bait here, going after the bishop, which is an inaccuracy. And they're also saying rook to f8 would have been better, just helping to guard in case pawn captures pawn. The rook could capture. So after capture with check, The only move possible now is what? Two options. King to h8 leads to a mate in 2 after what? Queen to h4 check. And then you would just have to block, and the queen would capture here with mate because of the aid of this pawn covering g8 now. So the best move is played, of course, king to h7, but it's not looking good with a mate in 5 possible. Capablanca doesn't use the quickest mate available, but he does attack here with check, and he's still winning easily. Block. We have this pawn pushing, and now both pieces are lining up on this pinned bishop. So the conclusion of the game, we have pawn attacking queen, capture, the king is running, and the game ended here. After this capture, if we look at the position, Capablanca is ahead, what, +3 in material. The king could go after this pawn, perhaps. And in fact, let's see, is that the only move possible? So if we look to see how the game could have continued, maybe something like this, and then what? Multiple options. The rook could swing over to e2, preventing the king from running. And then, with bishop, rook, and queen, those 3 pieces would swarm the king. But one example is check. And because of this pawn and bishop working together, covering all 3 of these squares, the king cannot, move forward at all. And the bishop is also preventing the king from running to the other side of the board. So what do we have here? If you play king up to e8, well, then it would be an immediate mate with bishop and queen here. So king to f8 is the best move. But now you have what? Either the rook check or this check, king forced to e8, and now rook check again. Knight blocks. Either way, it's not looking good. Wherever that knight goes, the rook can capture with mate. So if it goes back here or forward, that rook will capture, delivering the mate. All right. What can we learn from this? Well, transposition is important. Just remember, if you start out in one opening, be careful that you're not steered into an unfamiliar, different opening, or you could try and use that strategy yourself. If you learn the intricacies of the opening that you're using, you may be able to start in one type of opening and steer it into something you're more comfortable with to gain an advantage on your opponent. Also, we learned that Capablanca is one of the best players of all time. He played Colley, who's also a great player, but Capablanca is at the top of all time, so very tough to get a win against Capablanca at any time. All right, if we look at the accuracy rating here, let's see. It looks like Capablanca, well, take a look at this graph. Capablanca with the white pieces got a slight edge. He just kept that edge the entire time, slowly built it up until he got a winning advantage and just pressed on for the win there. He played with a 96.7% accuracy rating versus 82.9% by his opponent. And Capablanca also had one brilliant move and one great move. And as far as not so good moves, Capablanca just had 2 inaccuracies, but his opponent had 3 inaccuracies and 2 mistakes. And down below my image here, it states that Capablanca played with about a 2,500 rating level in this game, and his opponent only played at 2,150. And 100% opening accuracy for Capablanca versus 97.7 for Cully. And now we have 95.8% middle game accuracy for Capablanca versus only 79.1 for his opponent. All right. I hope you enjoyed this video, this review of a almost 100-year-old game played in 1929. Remember, you can definitely learn a lot from past masters, especially if you're a beginner or intermediate player. Sometimes the older chess masters are easier to understand as they played before we had great computer programs like we do today that can assist in helping find moves. And a lot of the top players today, their games are just much more complicated. And if you're looking for something that's more easily understandable, check the old chess masters, from 100 years ago or more even. And it also depends on your playing style. If you like solid strategic chess, I would definitely recommend more games by Capablanca, and go over those and see what you can learn. If you like more attacking chess, you may want to check out Paul Morphy, Mikhail Tal. That's another great attacking player. But there are many names, too many to mention them all here. So, as always, feel free to leave comments. I always enjoy hearing what viewers have to say. Feel free to like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching, and have a super chess day.